I knew the moment I saw the construction crew rolling up to my neighbor's house that my peaceful mornings in Asheville, North Carolina, were about to end. My name is Yates Williamson, and I had been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for exactly 3 years when the trouble started. I worked from home as a software developer, which meant I spent most of my days looking out my office window at the tree line that separated my property from my neighbors. That tree line was about to become the center of a nightmare that would consume the next 8 months of my life. The neighbor in question was Rebecca Morrison, though everyone in the neighborhood knew her by a different name. Behind closed doors, we all called her HOA Karen, though I tried to be diplomatic about it. Rebecca had appointed herself the unofficial sheriff of Meadowbrook Heights, despite the fact that we actually had a proper HOA board with elected members. She just happened to be the most vocal person on that board, and over time, she had essentially steamrolled everyone else into submission. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when the fence installation began. I was on a video call with a client in California when I heard the rumble of trucks. I glanced out the window and saw 3 workers unloading posts and panels. Rebecca stood there in her usual outfit, a pastel blazer with white pants, gesturing dramatically with her manicured hands as she directed the crew. At first, I didn't think much of it. Property owners put up fences all the time. But as the morning wore on and I watched the workers dig post holes, something started nagging at me. The fence line seemed to be encroaching pretty far into what I thought was my property. I tried to focus on my work, but by lunchtime, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I walked outside and stood at the edge of my driveway, watching the crew work. The fence was definitely closer to my house than I expected. I pulled out my phone and opened the property map I had saved when I bought the house. According to the survey I had done 3 years ago, the property line ran along a natural ridge about 15 feet from where they were currently installing posts. "Hey there, Yates," Rebecca's voice cut through the sound of power tools. She was walking toward me with that smile she always wore, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Rebecca?" I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I noticed you're putting up a fence." "Oh yes, isn't it lovely? Cedar panels, very upscale. I think it'll really enhance the neighborhood aesthetic." She clasped her hands together like she was presenting a prize on a game show. "Right, but I'm a little concerned about the placement. It looks like it might be on my property." Her smile didn't waver. "Oh no, sweetie. I had everything measured out. This is definitely my property line." I bristled at being called sweetie, but I kept my cool. "Did you have a survey done?" "Well, no, but I've lived here for 12 years. I know exactly where my property ends." "Rebecca, I had a professional survey done when I bought my house. I'm pretty sure that fence is over the line." Her expression finally changed, hardening into something cold. "Are you calling me a liar, Yates?" "I'm not calling you anything. I'm just saying we should verify the property line before you go any further." "I verified it already, with my own measurements." She crossed her arms. "And as a member of the HOA board, I have a responsibility to ensure that all fencing in this neighborhood meets our standards. My fence is perfectly placed and perfectly compliant. But if it's on my property, it's not." Her voice was sharp now. "And frankly, I find it a little offensive that you would come out here and try to stop a legitimate home improvement project. The HOA board approved this fence, by the way. So even if you had some frivolous complaint, which you don't, it wouldn't matter." I took a deep breath. "Look, all I'm asking is that we pause the installation and get a professional surveyor out here to confirm the property line. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize and you can continue. If I'm right, we need to adjust the placement." "There's nothing to adjust." She turned on her heel and started walking back toward the construction crew. This fence is going up exactly where I planned it. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the HOA board." "Oh, wait, that's me." She laughed at her own joke, and I felt my jaw clench. I watched her return to supervising the installation, knowing that this wasn't going to be resolved with a simple conversation. That evening, I dug out all my closing documents from when I bought the house. The survey was comprehensive, showing exact measurements and markers. According to the documentation, my property extended significantly further than where Rebecca's fence was going up. I measured it myself with a tape measure, and the fence was a full 5 feet onto my land. 5 feet might not sound like much, but it represented a strip of property that was about 60 feet long, running the entire length of my backyard. That was 300 square feet of my land that Rebecca was essentially stealing. I spent the next morning calling surveyors. The first 3 were booked solid for weeks, but the fourth, a company called Precision Land Surveying, said they could send someone out in 3 days. I scheduled the appointment immediately and sent Rebecca an email letting her know a surveyor would be coming and asking her to pause the fence installation until we had confirmation. She replied within 10 minutes. "Dear Yates, per my previous communication, the fence placement has been approved by the HOA board and is proceeding as planned. Your request to halt construction has been denied. Any surveyor you hire will confirm what I already know, which is that this fence is entirely on my property. I expect you to respect the HOA's decision and cease this harassment. Regards, Rebecca Morrison, HOA Board Secretary." Harassment. She was calling my legitimate property concern harassment. I forwarded the email to my real estate attorney, Martin Chen, whom I'd worked with during my home purchase. He called me within an hour. "Yates, this is pretty clear-cut," Martin said. "If her fence is on your property, she's trespassing. The HOA approval doesn't override your property rights." So what do I do? Get the survey done first. Document everything with photos and measurements. Once we have proof, we'll send her a formal demand letter to remove the fence. If she refuses, we file for an injunction and take her to court. This is insane. I just want her to put the fence on her own property. I know. Unfortunately, some people make simple things complicated, but the law is on your side here. Hang tight, get that survey done, and we'll proceed from there. The next 2 days were torture. I watched from my window as the fence went up, post by post, panel by panel. Rebecca supervised every step, occasionally glancing toward my house with a smug expression. By the time the surveyor arrived on Friday morning, the fence was nearly complete. The surveyor's name was Tom, a weathered man in his 60s who had been doing property surveys for 40 years. He spent 3 hours measuring, checking markers, and comparing everything to the county records and my original survey. "Well, Mr. Williamson," he said finally, showing me his tablet with the findings, "your instincts were right. That fence is 5 feet and 2 inches onto your property along the entire length of your rear boundary line." My stomach dropped even though I'd been expecting it. Seeing it confirmed in official measurements made it real. 5 feet, 2 inches to be exact. It's a significant encroachment. She's basically taken over 320 square feet of your land. What do I do now? You've got a few options. You could ask her nicely to move it, but based on what you've told me, that seems unlikely to work. You could sell her that strip of land, but I wouldn't recommend it since it would create an awkward property line and reduce your property value. Or you could take legal action to force her to remove it and relocate it to her actual property line. How much is this survey going to cost me? $1,500 for the full report, documentation, and court-ready materials. I winced but nodded. It was worth it to prove I was right. Tom said he'd have the official report ready by Monday. That afternoon, I walked next door with a printout of Tom's preliminary findings. Rebecca answered the door in a yoga outfit, holding a glass of white wine despite it being only 3 in the afternoon. "What now, Yates?" She sighed dramatically. "I had a professional surveyor out today. Your fence is 5 feet onto my property. I'm going to need you to move it." She glanced at the papers in my hand but didn't take them. "That's ridiculous. It's documented. Look, Rebecca, I don't want to make this a big thing. If you move the fence to the correct property line, we can forget this whole mess." "I'm not moving anything. That surveyor is obviously incompetent, or you paid him to lie. You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious. I've lived here for 12 years and I know where my property ends. Your little piece of paper doesn't change reality." She started to close the door. "Rebecca, if you don't move the fence, I'm going to have to take legal action." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "You're threatening me. I'm telling you what's going to happen. That fence is on my property. The law is clear about property rights. The HOA board approved that fence. You signed the HOA covenant when you bought your house. That means you agreed to abide by our decisions. The HOA doesn't have the authority to give away my property. We'll see about that." She slammed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, then walked back to my house. I called Martin immediately. "She refused," I told him. "She's claiming the HOA approval overrides my property rights." Martin actually laughed. "That's not how property law works. Okay, here's what we do. I'll draft a formal demand letter citing the survey results and giving her 10 days to remove the fence and restore your property. If she doesn't comply, we file for a preliminary injunction and take her to court." "How long will this take, if we go to court?" "Could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months, maybe longer. But based on what you're telling me, you have an airtight case. The survey proves the encroachment and property rights are pretty fundamental in American law." The demand letter arrived at Rebecca's house via certified mail on Wednesday. She had to sign for it, which meant I knew she received it. The letter was clear. Remove the fence within 10 days or face legal action. It also demanded that she pay for my survey costs since the survey had been necessitated by her illegal encroachment. Her response came not to me, but to the entire neighborhood. On Friday evening, every homeowner in Meadowbrook Heights received an email from the HOA board. The subject line read, "Important notice regarding property dispute." The email was a masterpiece of manipulation. Rebecca wrote that a disgruntled homeowner was attempting to harass and intimidate her with frivolous legal threats over a fence that had been properly approved by the HOA board. She claimed that I was trying to undermine the authority of the HOA and set a dangerous precedent that could lead to chaos and anarchy in the neighborhood. She urged all homeowners to stand united against my attack on our community standards. My phone started ringing within minutes. Some neighbors were confused, wanting to know my side of the story. Others were openly hostile, accusing me of being a troublemaker. One neighbor, an older man named Frank who lived 3 houses down, told me I should respect the HOA's authority and stop causing problems. I tried explaining that the fence was literally on my property, that I had survey evidence, that this wasn't about the HOA but about basic property rights. Some people understood. Most didn't want to get involved. A few seemed to think I was making a big deal out of nothing. "It's only 5 feet, one neighbor said. "Why can't you just let it go?" "Because it's my property," I replied. "Would you want someone to take 5 feet of your yard?" "Well, no, but Rebecca has been here a long time. You're kind of new. Maybe you should try to be more accommodating." That conversation summed up the frustrating dynamic in Meadowbrook Heights. Rebecca had been there long enough to build alliances and cultivate an image as the protector of property values and neighborhood standards. I was the newcomer who was rocking the boat. The 10-day deadline came and went. The fence remained exactly where it was. Martin filed the lawsuit in Buncombe County Superior Court, requesting a preliminary injunction to force removal of the fence and seeking damages for the survey costs, attorney fees, and the loss of use of my property. The court date for the preliminary injunction hearing was set for 6 weeks out, in early June. In the meantime, Rebecca ramped up her campaign against me. She sent another HOA email claiming I was suing the entire neighborhood, and that my frivolous lawsuit could result in higher HOA fees for everyone. She called an emergency HOA meeting, which I wasn't invited to, where she apparently convinced the other board members to authorize using HOA funds to help with her legal defense. I received a letter from an attorney named Patricia Holmes, representing Rebecca Morrison and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. The letter claimed that my lawsuit was without merit and that the fence had been properly installed in accordance with HOA guidelines and property records. It demanded that I withdraw the lawsuit or face a countersuit for harassment and defamation. Martin's response was swift and brutal. He sent a reply letter pointing out that property boundaries were a matter of surveyed fact, not HOA policy, and that threatening a countersuit for exercising legal rights was potentially sanctionable. He attached a copy of the survey report showing the 5-foot encroachment and invited Miss Holmes to have her own surveyor verify the findings. They never took him up on that offer. As June approached, the atmosphere in the neighborhood became increasingly tense. Rebecca organized a community barbecue that was obviously designed to exclude me. People stopped waving when they drove past my house. Someone left a note on my car that said, "Move away, troublemaker." I tried to ignore it and focus on my work, but it was hard. Every time I looked out my window, I saw that fence, sitting 5 feet onto my property, a constant reminder of Rebecca's audacity and stubbornness. The preliminary injunction hearing finally arrived on a humid Tuesday in early June. The Buncombe County Courthouse was a modern building in downtown Asheville, all glass and concrete. I met Martin in the lobby at 8 in the morning, both of us dressed in suits despite the heat. "Nervous?" Martin asked. "A little. What should I expect?" "The judge will hear both sides, review the evidence, and decide whether to grant the injunction. Since we have the survey showing clear encroachment, I'm confident, but you never know with judges." Rebecca arrived 15 minutes later with her attorney, Patricia Holmes, a severe-looking woman in a black pantsuit. Rebecca was dressed like she was going to a country club, in a floral dress and pearls. She glared at me across the lobby but didn't say anything. The hearing was in a small courtroom on the 3rd floor. Judge Margaret Thornton presided, a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes. She had a reputation, Martin had told me, for being no-nonsense and highly logical. Martin presented our case first. He showed the original survey from when I bought the house, Tom's recent survey showing the encroachment, and photographs clearly depicting the fence location relative to the property markers. He walked the judge through the measurements, the documentation, and the timeline of events. "Your Honor," Martin concluded, "this is a straightforward case of property encroachment. Mr. Williamson's neighbor has installed a fence 5 feet onto his property. He asked her to move it. She refused. The law is clear that a property owner has the right to exclusive use of their land. We're asking the court to order the immediate removal of the encroaching fence and to award Mr. Williamson his survey costs." Judge Thornton nodded and turned to Patricia Holmes. "Miss Holmes, I've reviewed your filings. I see you're arguing that the HOA approval somehow supersedes the property boundary issue. Would you like to elaborate? Patricia stood and launched into an argument about HOA covenants and community standards. She claimed that the HOA had authority over fence placement, and that my lawsuit was an attempt to undermine the neighborhood's governing structure. She suggested that the survey might be inaccurate, and that Rebecca had relied on her long-time knowledge of the property lines. Judge Thornton listened patiently, but I could see skepticism in her expression. When Patricia finished, the judge leaned back in her chair. Miss Holmes, I've read the HOA covenant. It gives the HOA authority to approve or deny fence applications based on aesthetic standards. It says nothing about the HOA having authority to alter legal property boundaries. Your Honor, the HOA board believed in good faith that the fence was on Miss Morrison's property. Belief isn't the same as fact. Mr. Williamson has presented 2 surveys, including one from when he purchased the property, both showing the same property line. Has Miss Morrison obtained her own survey to contradict these findings? Patricia hesitated. No, Your Honor, but then on what basis are you claiming the surveys are wrong? Miss Morrison has lived on her property for 12 years and has always understood the property line to be where she placed the fence. Understanding and reality are 2 different things. Miss Holmes, do you have any actual evidence that disputes the surveyed property line? We believe the survey may have errors. That's not evidence. That's speculation. Judge Thornton flipped through the documents in front of her. I'm looking at 2 professional surveys conducted 3 years apart by different companies, both showing the same property line. I'm looking at county records that confirm those surveys, and I'm looking at photographs that clearly show Miss Morrison's fence 5 feet onto Mr. Williamson's property. She looked up. Do you have anything to rebut this evidence? Your Honor, Miss Morrison is a respected member of the HOA board and has contributed significantly to the community. That's irrelevant to the question of property boundaries. The judge's tone was firm. Miss Holmes, I'm going to ask you directly. Do you have any surveyed evidence that shows the property line is where your client claims it is? No, Your Honor, but we would like time to obtain our own survey. You've had weeks since the lawsuit was filed. Why haven't you gotten a survey already? Patricia didn't have a good answer to that. Judge Thornton looked at some papers, made a few notes, then looked up at both attorneys. Here's my ruling. The evidence clearly shows that Miss Morrison's fence encroaches 5 feet onto Mr. Williamson's property. The HOA's approval of the fence is irrelevant to the property boundary issue. Mr. Williamson has the legal right to exclusive use of his property. She turned to Rebecca, who was sitting next to Patricia looking increasingly pale. Miss Morrison, you have 30 days to remove the fence and any related structures from Mr. Williamson's property. Failure to comply will result in contempt charges and additional fines. Additionally, you are ordered to pay Mr. Williamson's survey costs in the amount of $1,500. Both parties will submit their attorney fees for review, and I'll determine a reasonable award at that time. Rebecca stood up suddenly. Your Honor, that's not fair. I spent $8,000 on that fence. Then you should have verified the property line before installing it. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. I felt relief wash over me. Martin shook my hand with a grin. Couldn't have gone better, he said. I glanced over at Rebecca, who was arguing heatedly with Patricia in furious whispers. Her face was red, and she kept gesturing angrily in my direction. Patricia was trying to calm her down, but Rebecca was having none of it. As we left the courtroom, Rebecca followed us into the hallway. "This isn't over, Yates. I'm appealing this decision." Patricia grabbed her arm. "Rebecca, we need to talk about this privately. He's ruined everything. That fence was perfect. The neighborhood approved it." The judge made her ruling. "Come on, let's go to my office and discuss your options." Patricia managed to guide Rebecca toward the elevators, but not before Rebecca shot me one last venomous look. "You're going to regret this." Martin put a hand on my shoulder. "Ignore her. You won. She has to remove the fence." "Do you think she'll actually appeal?" "She can try, but she won't win. The evidence is too clear, and appeals are expensive. My guess is her attorney will talk her out of it once she calms down." We left the courthouse and grabbed lunch at a nearby cafe. I felt lighter than I had in months. The nightmare was finally ending. Rebecca would have to remove the fence. I'd get my property back, and she'd have to pay for the survey. Justice had been served, except Rebecca Morrison wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after the hearing. I came home from a grocery run to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA, informing me that my property had been inspected and found to have multiple violations of neighborhood standards. The violations included mailbox paint fading, lawn edging not maintained to standard, exterior light fixture not approved style, and trash can visible from street. Each violation came with a $50 fine. $200 total. I stared at the notice in disbelief. My mailbox was fine. My lawn was perfectly edged. The light fixture had been there when I bought the house. And my trash can was in the same place everyone else's was, tucked beside the garage. This was retaliation, pure and simple. I called Martin again. He sighed when I read him the notice. "She's being petty. Unfortunately, HOAs do have the right to enforce their covenants even if the timing is suspicious. So I have to pay these fines." "Not necessarily. You have the right to appeal to the HOA board. Document everything. Take photos of your property and your neighbor's properties, showing they have the same supposed violations. If she's singling you out, that's discriminatory enforcement, and you can fight it." I spent the rest of the day photographing every detail of my property and my neighbor's properties. Sure enough, half the mailboxes on the street had fading paint. Nobody's lawn edging was perfect. Exterior light fixtures came in at least 6 different styles, and everyone's trash cans were visible from the street. I submitted an appeal to the HOA board, complete with photos and a detailed explanation of why the fines were unjustified and discriminatory. The appeal hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, Rebecca continued her campaign. She sent another neighborhood-wide email claiming that the judge's ruling was legally questionable and that she was exploring all options to protect the community's interests. She started showing up at neighborhood events, spreading rumors that I was planning to sue other neighbors over minor property disputes. None of it was true, but damage to my reputation was already done. The HOA appeal hearing was held in the community clubhouse on a Wednesday evening. All 5 board members were present. Rebecca, the board president Dennis, the treasurer Maureen, and 2 at-large members, Judith and Carl. I showed up with my photo evidence and a printed copy of the HOA covenant highlighting the relevant sections. The meeting was supposed to be impartial, but it was clear from the start that Rebecca had poisoned the well. Dennis opened by saying that property standards are important to maintaining our home values, and that all residents must comply equally. Maureen nodded along with everything Rebecca said. I presented my evidence, showing that the supposed violations were either non-existent or equally present on multiple other properties. I argued that the fines were retaliatory and discriminatory. Rebecca dismissed it all. Just because other properties may have minor issues doesn't mean we should ignore violations when we find them. Yates's property was inspected, violations were found, and fines were appropriately assessed. But you haven't inspected any other properties, I pointed out. You only inspected mine, right after you lost in court. That's not fair enforcement. That's retaliation. I resent that accusation, Rebecca said, her voice dripping with false indignation. The HOA board takes its responsibilities seriously. We inspect properties on a rotating basis. Then show me the inspection schedule. Show me when you inspected other properties. Rebecca exchanged glances with Dennis. That information is internal to the board. Convenient. Yates, your attitude is not helping, Dennis said. The board has made its decision. The fines stand. If you don't pay within 30 days, additional late fees will be assessed. I looked at each board member in turn. Only Carl seemed uncomfortable with what was happening. The others were clearly siding with Rebecca. This is wrong, I said, and you all know it. I left the meeting furious. Back home, I called Martin yet again. He listened to the whole story and then delivered news I didn't want to hear. You can fight this, but it'll mean another lawsuit. HOA disputes are messy and expensive. Sometimes it's easier to just pay the fines and move on. But that's not fair, I know. But you have to ask yourself if it's worth the time, money, and stress to fight a $200 fine. You won the important battle. You're getting your property back. He was right, but it galled me to let Rebecca get away with such obvious retaliation. Still, I didn't have the energy for another legal fight. I paid the fines under protest and tried to move on. The 30-day deadline for Rebecca to remove the fence came and went. The fence remained standing. I waited a few extra days to see if she was just running behind schedule, but nothing happened. The fence stayed exactly where it was. I emailed Martin. The fence is still up. What do we do? File for contempt. The judge ordered her to remove it. If she hasn't complied, she's in violation of a court order. We filed the motion for contempt, and another hearing was scheduled for late July. This time, Judge Thornton was visibly annoyed when she saw the case back on her docket. Miss Holmes, the judge said, I ordered your client to remove the fence 30 days ago. Why is it still standing? Patricia stood. Your Honor, Miss Morrison has been exploring options for relocating the fence. The process is more complex than anticipated, and she needs additional time. I gave her 30 days. That's plenty of time to hire a contractor and move a fence. What's the actual reason for the delay? Patricia hesitated. Rebecca leaned over and whispered something to her. Patricia's expression suggested she wasn't happy with whatever she was hearing. Your Honor, Miss Morrison believes the survey may still be inaccurate and wanted to stop. Judge Thornton held up a hand. I ruled on this 6 weeks ago. The survey is accurate. The fence is on Mr. Williamson's property. Miss Morrison needs to remove it. This isn't optional. Your Honor, if I could just explain, there's nothing to explain. Miss Morrison is in contempt of court. The judge turned to Rebecca directly. Miss Morrison, do you understand that disobeying a court order has consequences? Rebecca stood up, her face flushed. Your Honor, that fence cost me $8,000. I can't afford to tear it down and rebuild it 5 feet over. It's not fair to your neighbor to have his property stolen. The cost of your mistake is not his responsibility. I didn't steal anything. The HOA approved. The HOA approval is irrelevant, as I've already explained. You built on land that isn't yours. That makes you responsible for fixing the problem. Judge Thornton made a note on her papers. I'm giving you one more chance. You have 14 days to remove that fence. If it's still standing after 14 days, you'll be fined $500 per day until it's removed. Additionally, I'm awarding Mr. Williamson his attorney fees for having to bring this contempt motion. Do I make myself clear? Your Honor, please. Do I make myself clear, Miss Morrison? Rebecca's mouth opened and closed. Finally, she whispered, Yes, Your Honor. Good. 14 days, not a day more. This time the gavel seemed even louder. Walking out of the courthouse, Martin was grinning. $500 a day, that'll motivate her. I can't believe she thought she could just ignore the order. Some people think rules don't apply to them. She's learning otherwise. I drove home feeling vindicated but also exhausted. This whole ordeal had been going on for 5 months. I just wanted it to end. The fence finally came down on day 13, just before the deadline. I watched from my window as a different construction crew dismantled the cedar panels and pulled up the posts. Rebecca supervised again, but this time her expression was pure fury. She kept looking toward my house, and I could practically feel her hatred radiating across the property line. The crew filled in the post holes and roughly graded the disturbed earth, leaving an ugly scar across my backyard where the fence had been. They loaded everything onto a truck and drove away. Rebecca stood there for a long moment, staring at the bare ground, then turned and went into her house without a word. 3 days later, the same crew returned and began installing the fence again, this time 5 feet over on what was actually Rebecca's property. The process took 2 full days. When it was finished, the fence looked identical to before, just in a different location. I took photos documenting the new fence line and sent them to Martin. It's done. The fence is finally on her property. Excellent. Now we just need to finalize the attorney fees. I'm preparing the final invoice for the court's review. The attorney fee hearing happened in mid-August. Judge Thornton reviewed Martin's billing and Rebecca's objections, then awarded me 75% of my attorney fees, which came out to about $4,500. Combined with the $1,500 for the survey, Rebecca was ordered to pay me $6,000. She didn't take it well. As we left the courtroom, she confronted me in the hallway again. I hope you're happy, she hissed. You've cost me over $15,000, $15,000 for 5 feet of dirt. You cost yourself that money by refusing to respect property lines, I said calmly. This neighborhood was perfect before you moved in. You've ruined everything. People are angry. The HOA fees are going up because we had to pay for legal defense. Everyone knows it's your fault. Everyone knows you built a fence on my property and refused to move it. I'm not done with you, Yates. I will make your life miserable here. Every little violation, every minor issue, I will find it and fine you for it. You'll regret ever crossing me. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you. Patricia appeared and pulled Rebecca away again, apologizing to me as she did. She's just upset. The stress of the case has been hard on her. She doesn't mean it. But I knew Rebecca meant every word. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca made good on her threat. My property was inspected twice more, resulting in fines for absurdly minor issues like a small oil stain on my driveway and a loose board on my fence. I appealed both times. The appeals were denied both times. I paid the fines because fighting would cost more than the fines themselves, but the harassment was wearing me down. Then something unexpected happened. I received an email from Carl, the at-large HOA board member who had seemed uncomfortable during my previous appeal. He asked if we could meet for coffee. I was suspicious but agreed. We met at a Starbucks near the neighborhood. Carl was a retired accountant, soft-spoken and deliberate. He got straight to the point. Yates, I want to apologize for how you've been treated. What Rebecca is doing isn't right. Then why does the board keep backing her up? Because she's been here forever, and she's very good at making people think she's protecting property values. But I've been going through the HOA records, and I found some things that concern me." He pulled out a folder and showed me financial statements. According to the records, the HOA had spent almost $9,000 on Rebecca's legal defense during the fence case. "That seems high," I said. "It is high. And here's the thing. The HOA covenant says that the board can provide legal defense for members only if they're being sued in their official capacity as board members. You didn't sue Rebecca as a board member. You sued her as an individual property owner. The HOA shouldn't have spent a dime on her defense." I leaned back in my chair. "So she misused HOA funds. That's what it looks like, and that's not all." He showed me more records. "She's been approving expenditures without proper board votes. She's been giving herself reimbursements for expenses that seem questionable. And she's been using HOA funds to pay for neighborhood improvement projects that mostly seem to benefit her own property." "How much are we talking about?" "Over the past 3 years. Maybe $25,000 that's either misused or improperly documented." I let out a low whistle. "That's embezzlement." "It might be. I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't look right. I've talked to Judith, the other at-large member, and she agrees. We want to call for a special meeting to remove Rebecca from the board and conduct a full financial audit." "What can I do to help?" "Just show up to the meeting and vote. We need a majority of homeowners present to make it official." The special meeting was scheduled for early September. Carl and Judith sent out the notice, clearly stating the purpose: to address concerns about financial management and board conduct. Rebecca sent out her own email, calling the meeting a witch hunt orchestrated by disgruntled homeowners who wanted to undermine the HOA's stability. The meeting was held at the clubhouse on a Saturday afternoon. Nearly 40 homeowners showed up, an unprecedented turnout. The room was packed and tense. Carl chaired the meeting since Rebecca had been temporarily suspended pending the outcome. He presented the financial evidence clearly and calmly, showing each questionable expense and explaining why it violated the HOA covenant. Judith backed him up with additional documentation. Rebecca tried to defend herself, claiming everything she did was for the good of the neighborhood and that the financial irregularities were just accounting errors. But as Carl methodically went through each issue, her explanations became less and less convincing. When the vote came, it was overwhelming. 32 homeowners voted to remove Rebecca from the board. Only 5 voted to keep her, and 3 of those were her close friends. Rebecca stood up, her face white with shock and anger. "You're all making a huge mistake. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without my guidance. Property values will plummet. Crime will go up. You'll regret this." Nobody responded. She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The board voted to hire a forensic accountant to review all HOA finances going back 5 years. They also voted to retain a lawyer to determine if criminal charges should be filed. Finally, they voted to rescind all the fines that had been assessed against me, acknowledging that they had been retaliatory and improper. I stayed after the meeting to thank Carl and Judith. "I can't believe she was embezzling from the HOA. Power corrupts," Carl said. "She'd been in charge for so long that she started thinking the rules didn't apply to her. Your fence situation just exposed what was already happening." The forensic accountant's report came back 6 weeks later. It confirmed that Rebecca had misused approximately $27,000 in HOA funds over a 4-year period. Some of it was spent on her legal defense for personal matters, including the fence case. Some went to contractors who did work on her property but billed the HOA. Some was simply reimbursements for personal expenses that she claimed were HOA related. The HOA board filed a civil lawsuit against Rebecca to recover the funds. They also reported the findings to the Asheville Police Department. I wasn't directly involved in the criminal investigation, but I heard through neighborhood gossip that the police had interviewed Rebecca multiple times. The district attorney apparently reviewed the case and decided that, while Rebecca's conduct was improper and potentially fraudulent, it didn't rise to the level of criminal embezzlement that they wanted to prosecute. The amounts were too small, and there was enough ambiguity about some expenses that proving criminal intent would be difficult. However, the civil case proceeded. Rebecca's attorney tried to argue that she had acted in good faith and that any financial irregularities were unintentional. But the forensic accountant's report was damning, and Rebecca had almost no documentation to support her claimed expenses. In early December, nearly 9 months after the fence dispute started, Rebecca settled the civil case. She agreed to pay back the full $27,000 plus the HOA's legal fees. She also signed an agreement permanently barring her from serving on the HOA board or any leadership position in the neighborhood. I heard she put her house up for sale in January. By March, she was gone. I was in my backyard on a warm afternoon in late March, exactly 1 year after the fence dispute started, when my new neighbor came over to introduce himself. His name was David, a friendly guy in his 30s who worked as a high school teacher. We talked about the neighborhood, the HOA's new management, and the general sense of relief that seemed to have settled over Meadowbrook Heights since Rebecca's departure. I heard there was some drama with the previous owner, David said. Something about a fence, I smiled. Yeah, something like that. She built a fence 5 feet onto my property and refused to move it. 5 feet. That's pretty significant. It was. Ended up going to court. The judge made her move it and pay my survey fees. Then it came out she'd been misusing HOA funds for years. It was a whole thing. Wow, well, I promise not to build any fences on your property. I appreciate that. We shook hands and David went back to unpacking. I stood there for a moment, looking at the fence line, now exactly where it was supposed to be. The grass had grown back over the scar where Rebecca's fence had briefly stood. You couldn't even tell there had been a dispute. The whole ordeal had cost me time, money, and stress. But it had also taught me something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Rebecca had counted on me backing down, accepting her encroachment because fighting seemed like too much trouble. A lot of people would have done exactly that, but property rights matter. Truth matters. And sometimes you have to fight, even when it's exhausting and expensive and socially uncomfortable, because some principles are worth defending. I went back inside and returned to my home office, sitting down at my desk and looking out at the tree line. My tree line. On my property. Exactly where it should be. The whole experience had changed the neighborhood too. The new HOA board was more transparent and accountable. Financial statements were shared openly. Decisions required actual votes instead of one person's decree. People were friendlier and less afraid of speaking up when something seemed wrong. In a weird way, Rebecca's fence had been a catalyst for positive change. By overreaching so dramatically, by being so stubborn and vindictive, she'd exposed the rot that had been growing in the HOA's leadership. Her downfall had made room for better governance and a healthier community. I got a final check from Rebecca's attorney in April, covering the $6,000 in survey costs and attorney fees that Judge Thornton had awarded me. I used part of it to take a vacation, something I desperately needed after the stress of the previous year. I drove up to Maine and spent a week hiking and kayaking and not thinking about fences or HOAs or property lines. When I got back, I planted a row of native shrubs along the correct property line, marking it naturally and beautifully. The shrubs would grow and fill in, creating a living border that nobody could dispute. David saw me planting them and came over to help. We spent the afternoon working together, talking and laughing, and I realized that this was what a neighborhood should feel like. Cooperative, friendly, respectful. Not everyone had been supportive during the fence dispute. Some neighbors still thought I'd made too big a deal about 5 feet. But most people, once they understood what had really happened and learned about Rebecca's financial misconduct, recognized that I'd done the right thing. A few even apologized for not supporting me earlier. Frank, the older neighbor who had told me to respect the HOA's authority, came by with a 6-pack of beer one evening. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I thought you were being difficult. I didn't realize Rebecca was stealing from all of us." "You didn't know," I said. "She was good at hiding it." "Still, I should have listened to your side instead of just assuming. I'm sorry." We sat on my porch and drank the beer and talked about the neighborhood's future. Frank told me stories about when he'd first moved in, before Rebecca had consolidated power, when the HOA was more democratic and less controlled. "It's good to see it getting back to that," he said. The new HOA board implemented several reforms. They limited board member terms to prevent anyone from entrenching themselves. They required financial reports at every meeting. They created an independent audit committee. And they established clear procedures for resolving disputes, including mandatory surveys before any fence installations along property lines. "We're calling it the Williamson Rule," Carl joked at one meeting. "All fences require professional surveys first." I laughed, but I was glad the rule existed. Nobody else would have to go through what I'd gone through. By summer, life in Meadowbrook Heights had settled into a pleasant rhythm. The neighborhood organized a block party in July, the first in several years. Kids played in the street while adults grilled burgers and talked. David brought his guitar and played music. Judith made her famous potato salad. Even the weather cooperated, giving us a perfect sunny day. I stood in the middle of it all, holding a cold drink and watching my neighbors laugh and enjoy themselves, and felt genuinely happy. The fence dispute seemed like ancient history now, a bad dream that had finally ended, but I never forgot the lessons it taught me. I learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, is worth it. I learned that bullies and tyrants eventually fall when people have the courage to challenge them. I learned that the legal system, for all its flaws, generally works when you have evidence and patience. And I learned that communities can heal and improve when toxic leadership is removed. Most importantly, I learned that 5 feet of property might not seem like much to some people, but principles aren't measured in feet. They're measured in whether you're willing to defend them. Rebecca Morrison built a fence 5 feet onto my property, thinking she could get away with it because she had power and influence. She was wrong. Judge Thornton made her move that fence, pay my survey fees and pay my attorney fees. And the investigation that followed exposed years of financial misconduct that ultimately drove her out of the neighborhood entirely. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it's expensive and exhausting. But sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, justice prevails exactly as it should. I still live in that house on Meadowbrook Heights. The shrubs along the property line have grown thick and green, marking the boundary clearly. David is a great neighbor. The HOA functions properly and transparently. And every time I look out my office window at that perfect, legally correct property line, I smile. Because that fence, That stupid fence that caused so much trouble ended up being the best thing that could have happened to our neighborhood. It exposed a tyrant, reformed a corrupt system, and reminded everyone that property rights and truth matter more than keeping the peace with someone who refuses to follow the rules. The fence is exactly where it belongs now, 5 feet over from where Rebecca originally built it. On her old property, now belonging to David, who respects boundaries and common decency. And my property, all of it, remains mine. That's how the story ends. Not with dramatic confrontations or shocking revelations, but with quiet victory and lasting change. Sometimes that's the best kind of ending. The one where everything finally makes sense, where justice is served, and where you can look back on a difficult experience and see that it made things better in the end. I never saw Rebecca Morrison again after she moved away. I heard rumors that she moved to a condo in Charlotte where there was no HOA for her to control. I hope she learned something from the experience, though I suspect she probably blames everyone but herself. People like that rarely change, but I changed. I became more confident in standing up for myself. I became more involved in the neighborhood, eventually joining the HOA board myself to make sure the reforms Carl and Judith implemented would stick. I became a voice for fairness and transparency, using my own experience as an example of why those things matter. And I never, ever let anyone push me around over property rights again. The 5 feet Rebecca tried to steal taught me that every inch matters when it's yours. The law backs that up. Common sense backs that up. And any reasonable person, when presented with facts and evidence, will back that up too. Judge Margaret Thornton understood that. She looked at the surveys, saw the truth, and made the right decision. She didn't let HOA politics or neighborhood drama cloud her judgment. She applied the law as it was written, and she held Rebecca accountable when she tried to ignore a court order. That judge, more than anyone, was the hero of this story. She cut through all the noise and confusion and made a clear, correct ruling that protected my rights and set things right. And then she enforced that ruling with escalating penalties until Rebecca had no choice but to comply. That's how the system is supposed to work. And in this case, despite all the frustration and delay, it did work. So here I am, 2 years after that construction crew first rolled up to Rebecca's house, sitting in my office and writing this story down. I'm writing it because I want other people to know that you don't have to accept it when someone violates your property rights. You don't have to back down because fighting seems too hard. You don't have to let bullies win just because they are loud and confident and have been around longer than you. Get a survey. Document everything. Hire a lawyer if you need to. Stand your ground. The law is on your side when you're in the right, and judges understand property boundaries better than HOA boards do. Rebecca Morrison's fence ended up exactly where it should have been from the start, 5 feet over on her own property. And I got my property back, my survey fees paid, and my attorney fees covered. Justice was served completely and appropriately. That's the story of how HOA Karen built a fence 5 feet onto my property, and how a judge made her move it and pay my costs. It's a story about standing up for yourself, about the importance of property rights, and about how corrupt leadership eventually falls when people have the courage to challenge it. And it's a true story, every word of it, from start to finish. Because sometimes reality delivers exactly the justice that ought to happen, if you're patient enough and determined enough to see it through. The fence is where it belongs. The neighborhood is healthier. And I sleep well at night knowing I did the right thing, even when it was hard. That's all there is to tell. The fence dispute is over. The corrupt HOA board member is gone, and life in Meadowbrook Heights goes on better than it was before, Sometimes the good guys actually do win. This was one of those times.